Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, gats and gittens, welcome back once again for another edition of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you merry few, you band of brothers, get to ask me questions about what I do for a living, and what I do for a living is write comic books. So remember, there are those yet abed, holding their manhood cheap, who wish they were here with us on Ask Chuck Dixon Day. David Wolf, if you were given the keys to the DC Kingdom with a mandate of rebooting the characters and continuities, would you, 1, blow it up completely and start everything over from absolute scratch? 2, cherry pick which stories were still canon and then essentially publish a list of which stories were still in continuity and which weren't? 3, rewind the tape to a certain point in time, 0 hour, just as an easy example, and then move forward from that point on. For clarification, everything up to ZH would be in continuity, nothing after ZH. Which of these or none of these would be the best approach and why? Well, welcome to I Tell You What I Do, man. It's continuity is something you're never going to get completely a hold of, because they've made it so vast and huge. I wouldn't think of terms in continuity or in terms of characters. I would think more in terms of creators. And I've said this when they started the New 52. I made this pretty clear, and this is something that has been a part of comics history. Is you don't want a bunch of editors sitting in a room figuring out the world these characters live in and then handing that world over to the creators. You want the creators creating that world. And after all, the Marvel Universe was not created in a day. It was created over time in an assembly of stories. And it was all done loosey-goosey and messy and everything else. But hey, it turned out pretty good, didn't it? It turned out pretty good, and in the end, it was pretty darn consistent. So what I would do is, what I would have done in New 52, just as an example, I would have found 52 creative teams, writer and artist, and said, would you be interested in taking on this character and just running wild? And there are very few rules. You can't willy-nilly start killing or altering characters long associated with this franchise. In other words, you can't just, kill Dr. Octopus. You can't just make Commissioner Gordon a woman. You stick to what was before, but beyond that, go crazy, go nuts. And we'll figure out the continuity as we go along, and we'll all play nice. And I think that the teams of creators would play nice. I mean, comics is a small town. So many of us know each other or are willing to meet each other and talk and not get in each other's way. And I think everybody would have played nice for the most part. There's a few people that never want to play nice, but what are you going to do? So you give them Firestorm. But that's what I would do. I would have the creators run it with the editors editing. Guiding, doing what editors are supposed to do, putting up guideposts, putting up guardrails and saying, don't go beyond this point, don't go beyond that point. And yeah, it's harder work for the editors, but they haven't been doing much recently. I don't see where these books are really being edited by anybody. I don't know what they're doing, taking really, really long lunches, coming in late, leaving early. I don't know what they're doing. They've largely just become traffickers of artwork and scripts, and that's not an editor's job. That's an associate or assistant editor's job. So that is what I would do. I would just let the creators, because remember, this isn't the first time. I mean, the Marvel Universe and its creation, they took established Marvel characters left over from the Golden Age, Submariner, Human Torch, Captain America, and they let, in some cases, the original creators, but in many cases, new creators take those characters in a different direction. another, Denny O'Neil's changes to Batman. They weren't done in a company-wide sweep and a complete change of continuity. It was just a new creative team, new sheriff in town. We're going to do things differently, and they did. John Byrne on Superman. They didn't change the whole line of comics. They just allowed John Byrne to alter or reboot the Superman continuity. And he did it in such a way that it was painless for all of the other titles. And it sort of, set markers around Superman. This is the changes we're making, and this is, when you refer to Superman or whatever, you're not going to refer to these things we've done away with, and you are going to refer with these new things we've created. And it all seemed pretty painless to me. It didn't require a complete company overhaul to do that. So I think continuity is something that is amorphous. It's malleable. It's whatever you want it to be. We're making stories up. It's all made up. So let the creators make new stuff up, or and don't get in their way. Let them, like I said, go wild. I mean, I certainly made an awful lot of alterations to Batman when I was on it, and they didn't impact the rest of the continuity. They just impacted Batman. In fact, they didn't even really impact Batman, because I don't think a lot of the stuff I created lasted beyond me. Alterations to the Batcave and new Bat vehicles and new Bat gadgets and all that stuff, and naming streets and naming bridges and naming rivers around God. I don't think any of that survived, me after I left. So another thing I would do at DC is I would explore other genres. Vertigo is the last successful attempt in comics for a major comic book company to try to find a new audience, and it was largely successful. I mean, I didn't care for a single Vertigo title, but I wasn't the audience for them. They, whoever the audience was for them, they responded, and Vertigo was successful. It launched a number of movie and television franchises, and it did pretty good. And it was an active search for a new audience for comics, a new niche for buying comics, and I think they need more of that. Not necessarily bringing Vertigo back, which wouldn't be a bad idea, but thinking about other genres. I would bring back the war comics, and because they had a huge audience in the 1970s, the Bronze Age. The war and Western comics at DC were their top selling titles, and for good reason. It was quality stuff, and readers hey, guess what? Readers responded to quality. So that's what I would do. I would let the creators run wild, and I would find other other genres, and by finding those other genres, you're going to find new audiences. I mean, I'd have a mystery line of comics, a crime line of comics, whatever, a spy, whatever's popular at the time. That's the way comics used to be. Whatever genre was popular in TV or movies, the comics tried to ape it. But ever since the 80s, it's been superheroes all the time, 24/7. And we see what happens when you just, only serve vanilla at your ice cream stand. You're going to lose to the competition. Christopher Cohen. Given Denny created Arkham, did you ever consider a story revealing the asylum had some Lovecraftian influence over its inmates' patients, elevating their mental illness to super insanity and their levels of aggression to super violence? If not, do you think looking back it could have been worth exploring? Honestly, no. If you were to say that there's some malign influence at Arkham, that some poor guy that has a nervous breakdown, he's committed to Arkham, and 6 months later, he's a raving lunatic with his teeth filed at the fangs, and able to see through walls. No, I don't like that idea at all. I like the idea that Batman is more related to the real world, even though it's a fantastical version of the real world. It's an exaggerated version of the real world. We have people, obviously, we have people who are dangerously, criminally insane, who have to be segregated from society. Once upon a time, we had asylums for them. Now we have tent cities along the streets of most northern cities. is where we keep the dangerously insane. So coming to a park bench near you. But I think Arkham Asylum should be, because if you give this Lovecraftian thing that you're talking about, the supernatural element that affects the inmates of Arkham, you're giving them a shared origin, and that's never a good idea. It's kind of dull. It makes them seem unlike individuals. Would I want to think that Joker and Riddler and Poison Ivy were all born of the same influence? No, it takes a lot away from those characters. So I would not do that. Although I will give you a twin spin. But boom. How about that? Tell the family around the dinner table, I got a twin spin on Ask Chuck Dixon. And they'll say, did you mow the lawn? Okay. Christopher Cohen again. Regarding Elseworld stories, did you ever consider a story where Alfred died when Bruce was still young and how he might have turned out without Alfred's positive influence? I'll bet you a nickel that that's been proposed dozens and dozens and dozens of times and rejected. Because it's, once again, it's not a very interesting story. Because as Archie Goodwin used to say, jokingly, from there, you could go anywhere. I mean, without Alfred's influence, you could, Bruce Wayne, young Bruce Wayne, might have gone in a million different directions. But I think what we all understand is the humanizing, mitigating influence of Alfred, his wisdom, his guidance, his mentorship of young Bruce is what shaped Bruce into the adult he was. And I think we all also understand that if Alfred had his druthers, Bruce would never have become Batman. But even as a child, and that's where that's the thing about Batman in my mind, he's a character born out of childhood trauma. This childhood trauma driving Bruce, Alfred couldn't stand in the way of that. Even as a child, Bruce had the strength of will that he knew how he was going to direct his life. And when Alfred realizes this, well, I can't stop him, but I've got to be here and do what I can. And that's the beauty of the relationship. And of course, without him, most likely you would have a psychotic loner Batman who would, go further and further into the darker side of life, the grimmer side of life, possibly becoming a lethal crime fighter as he was in his earliest iterations in the Golden Age. But I think we pretty much answered the question already about what would happen if we had a Batman without Alfred's influence. Nightfall pretty much answered that question with Jean-Paul Vallée becoming a homicidal psychotic maniac, which I think we know he was before he donned the Batman mantle. There was a lot of things about Jean-Paul Vallée that Bruce Wayne didn't know that we knew as readers, which really made the story even cooler, right? Because we know, hey, I know something you don't know. Batman doesn't know what's really happening, and we do. And I love stories like that. But yeah, Azrael as Bats kind of answers that question. What if there was Batman, but there had been no Alfred? So, boom. Two good questions, though, I gotta say. Puzzlers. Ryan Barrett. I purchased Storming Paradise 6 and read that last night. I had not read 1 through 5 since the store didn't have them. So there's obviously a lot I don't know about the series. Judging from this final issue of the limited series, Storming Paradise seems quite different from the Batman comics of yours I recall reading years ago. I'm just now getting back to your work, but after reading this comic, I ended up enjoying immensely. I have a few questions. While there is a story within Storming Paradise number 6, you seem to focus more on generating within the reader a feeling of loss, dread, and melancholy. At what point for you as a storyteller can a narrative not matter as much as the feeling it generates in its audience? Yeah, you made me think a lot about this series. Now, if you've never read Storming Paradise or even heard of Storming Paradise, it's a 6-issue limited series I did for Wildstorm with Butch Geis, and we collaborated on this story that posed a very real historical what-if question. This was a inflection point, a true inflection point in history where the world might have gone in an entirely different direction. And uh, what we did, what Butch and I posited was, what if the atomic bomb did not work? What if it failed in its initial tests and eventually uh, the United States would have had to have invaded Japan in an amphibious landing? And it would have been an absolute nightmare. It would have been an absolute nightmare. And this 6-issue miniseries portrays that, what it would have been like. Um, the the American plans for the invasion of Japan, and it would have been America alone. England made it very clear. All of our allies, Canada, made it very clear they would not be participating in this invasion. They'd had enough. They'd been at war a couple of years longer than us, and they were just exhausted from war, and they couldn't ask their soldiers to go to Japan for this invasion. And so, the United States was going to run it alone. And I was able to read the plans, United States plans for the invasion of Japan became declassified a few years before I wrote this. I was able to read what their plans were. That they were going to attack the southernmost of the main Japanese islands. They were going to start there and then basically work their way northward. I also read the defense plans that the Japanese declassified of how they were going to defend the home islands against amphibious landing and parachute attacks. And it paints a picture of pure annihilation. This would have been one of the bloodiest, nastiest, most horrible battles in human history, without a doubt. Most historians estimate 1 million dead, and that is a conservative estimate. I think it would have been much higher, and I mean 1 million dead Americans. God knows how many dead Japanese would have died in the invasion of Japan, because the war in the Pacific, if you know anything about World War II, it was very different than the war in Europe. The war in the Pacific and the war in Southeast Asia with the British and Australian armies is often referred to as a war without mercy. No prisoners, no quarter, no rules of engagement. Just kill the enemy. I forget which admiral. It might have been Admiral Halsey had signs installed on a number of the embattled islands that just read, "Kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs." This is the mindset. It was a war of attrition, war of annihilation, and the invasion of Japan would have been devastating to both the United States and Japan, but mostly to Japan. The American public was very angry at Japan over Pearl Harbor. I know people, my grandmother, other people who never forgave Japan for Pearl. They were as mad years in the 70s as they were the day after Pearl Harbor about Pearl Harbor. And so there was an anger, a rage toward Japan that the United States government did a lot of work post-war to reduce. Okay, they downplayed the role of the emperor in the war. They tried to make it look like he was a bystander or practically a hostage. None of that's true. And they downplayed the war crimes the Japanese committed, the horrible things they did to British and American prisoners, the horrible things they did to the Chinese, the Koreans, any other population they ran across. The Japanese Imperial Army were every bit the equal of the SS in those regards. And a lot of effort was made to make sure that the American public would eventually forgive and forget. Had we invaded Japan, we would have had to destroy the island, because their defenses, every single man, woman, and child on Japanese soil was committed to killing American soldiers, every single one. And there were all kinds of layers of defense and traps. Every citizen, if they didn't have a rifle, was taught to use a bamboo stave to kill. You can't even begin to imagine the level of defenses, the level of deep tiered defenses the Japanese had set up in advance an American invasion. And had that happened, and had 1 million Americans died on the battlefield, and God knows how many Japanese died, it would have literally been the end of Japanese culture. And I'm not exaggerating, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his cabinet, as the World War II was beginning to draw to a close in Europe, and it was obvious, we were going to win. And, pretty late in the game, obvious, but, it was touch and go there for a while. But in the final months of the war, it was obvious we were going to be victorious. And Germany was going to fall. The Third Reich was going to fall. Roosevelt's plans for Germany, and Stalin was all on board with this, was to transform Germany into I'm sorry if I'm getting a little too historical here on a ostensibly comic book website, but I'll go on. You can go watch something else if I'm dragging this out. Anyway, Roosevelt and Stalin were in agreement that Germany be transformed into an agrarian society. In other words, they were going to turn Germany into the breadbasket of Europe. Germany would be allowed no hard industries. They would be allowed to manufacture nothing. No cars, no ships, no railroad, no nothing. They would all be made into farmers. They were going to turn the clock back on Germany 200 years. And it was Churchill who said, you can't do that because you're blaming the German people for the Nazis. You're conflating the two. The German people, they've learned their lesson. They're going to go back to being Germans, hardworking, industrious Germans. And they are going to once again be the economic powerhouse of Europe. He says, without Germany as an industrial power, he said, all of the European nations will suffer. And we see this today. I mean, Germany is really paying all the bills in Europe. So Churchill was dead on accurate. And he stopped this idea of turning back the clock on the German people. Now, he would not have been able to do that for Japan if we had had to invade Japan. If the United States had to invade Japan, millions of casualties on both sides, the country destroyed. We would have to completely destroy Japan, and then we would occupy it, and we probably would have occupied it to this day, and we would alter Japanese society. Now, Japan is very much a homogenous society. It's very much all Japanese. I mean, you can move to Japan, but you can't become Japanese. We would have taken that away. We would have taken away everything that was special. We would have destroyed their heritage. We would have imprisoned their emperor. We would have just gutted that country, and literally we would have laid waste to their culture the way the Romans laid waste to the culture of Carthage, and started over again with something else. And who knows what Japan would look like today, and who knows what our world would look like today without Japan, as it is meant to be, without the Japanese people and their culture, continuing to exist. And that's what we posited. And largely, you're right. I was going for a mood with this book. It's a war story. It's a little bit of a spy story. It's a little bit of a suspense thing. But overall, it's an ensemble cast, a collection of vignettes. It's much like the movie Longest Day, which is a series of vignettes about the D-Day landing. It didn't so much try to tell the whole overarching story of D-Day as what D-Day was like seen through the eyes of individuals participating in it. That's very much what I wanted to do here. I also wanted to present in the starkest way possible the horror that this event would have become over time. The absolute nightmare of a battle scenario that the invasion of Japan would present. And I think Butch and I pulled it off pretty good. And the hopelessness, maybe your grandfather, maybe your dad would have had to have gone to Japan. I know my father-in-law, he he was in Colorado training, getting ready to ship out for an amphibious landing in Japan. And then the war ended. And he had already served in Italy with 10th Mountain Division. He'd already been in combat for 2 years. And they were going to send him to Japan along with, everyone else in his unit and lots of other. And my own father might have been called up again. He was in the Army Air Corps. So a lot of us, quite frankly, wouldn't be here today if Japan had been invaded, because our dads or granddads would have died there. So something to think about. And I wanted to present that. So that readers would have an understanding of the apocalyptic nature of this military action, which fortunately never happened. And so there you go. Now, Ryan has a further question. You end with the Emperor's poem. Poems do not typically contain a narrative, but aim to evoke emotions and feelings. Did you write this limited series as more of something akin to a poem rather than a narrative? It's almost dreamlike. Yeah, I think, I'm not one of these guys who says, I'm going to write it this way, or I'm going to use this tone, or this is the theme of my work. All of my characters will learn this by the end of the story. I just don't write that way. I just have a feeling, a gut feeling, a number of big scenes, an idea of where I want to go, and I just start going there. And I think the fact that this is set in Japan and features an ensemble cast of Japanese characters as well as an ensemble cast of American military characters, I wanted to include haiku. And haiku poetry is all about feeling and emotion and, senses, rather than a narrative. There's never a narrative in haiku. It's, if you know anything about haiku, you probably taught haiku in school, or if you weren't, you should have been. And so we end on the Emperor's haiku, just to show basically how detached from reality he is. So yeah, that's where I was going, or that's where I got to eventually. I didn't plan any of this. It seemed to be the best way to tell the story, and it sort of evolved over time. And I gotta say, Butch had a lot of input as well. And just as an aside, two famous people appear in this, and other than, Harry Truman and Robert Oppenheimer and characters like that. We have John Wayne appear, and I remember DC and Wildstorm were very, you can't have John Wayne in it. His, estate will sue. We can't have his likeness. So we never actually see him, and we refer to him obliquely, but it's John Wayne. That John, we posit that John Wayne, Butch and I posited that John Wayne would have eventually, enlisted. There was always this talk about him enlisting, but the studios would say, hey, just do one more picture. And the war ended before he could enter the war. But we posit that he would have entered, and he would have been part of the invasion of Japan. We also show a young George Bush, who was a carrier fighter pilot, shot down twice by the Japanese, and we show his participation in this story. Overall, it was a blast to work on. And Butch, I think I began to say that Butch had a lot of input here. Butch is a story guy, and he had a lot of input. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of collaboration, which I welcome. And I just like talking to Butch anyway. And we were really on the same page all the way down the line on this, and had a lot of fun working on it. Joshua Ignatowski. In the hypothetical scenario of Marvel letting a writer who cared about both the character and the audience write Amazing Spider-Man without hostile interference from editorial, what do you believe a writer would need to do to write stories that recaptured some of the magic that Ditko's run had? Denny O'Neil, Alan Grant, Doug Manchin, of course, you yourself were able to write plenty of new Batman stories that recaptured the magic of his Golden Age tales. And you've spoken of how you do something similar for the FF, and you were able to write a run on their comic series. So I am led to believe that this kind of thing can be done for Spider-Man as well. Hey, 10% more Ignatowski this episode. Just thought I'd let you know that. Ditko laid down a template that I used for Robin. When I wrote my Robin monthly, I very much influenced not by the events or the ideas or plot lines of Ditko's Spider-Man, but by the way he would layer story and his attention to the ensemble cast and the importance of Tim Drake's secret identity to the stories. That, let's never forget that who's being Robin. Just as Ditko never let us forget who's Spider-Man. He's Peter Parker. He's that's who he is. He is Peter Parker. He disguises himself as Spider-Man, but he doesn't become Spider-Man. He sort of takes on Spider-Man as an alternate guise. But we never forget that it's this punk teenage kid, this nerd, this guy who can't get a date, this guy who has a sickly aunt at home, this guy who feels like the weight of the world is on his shoulders, as all teenagers do, and it made him, it made him alive in our minds. It made him relatable. We cared what happened to him, and there was always something percolating under the surface in the Ditko stories. And I mean, how hard would it be to get back to that? And it's more of a concentration on the ensemble cast, the building an ensemble cast, creating stories that grow out of that cast, not character-driven stories, but plots suited to those characters and complications and things that grow out of it. I mean, remember, Harry Osborn with his drug addiction, things like that. I mean, how hard would it be to get back to that kind of story, to re-emphasize Peter Parker? I would also, try to take Peter Parker back to what he was in the Ditko era. As a reader, reading these as a kid, I didn't like it. Well, I didn't like it when Ditko left at all, but I didn't like it when Ditko left and Stan Lee kind of made Peter Parker cooler. He turned him from the nerd, isolated by the rest of his classmates, into this cooler guy who lost the glasses, started dressing sharper, at least from the standpoint of the 40-year-old men drawing the comic. And, as you see in this picture, he's riding a motorcycle. He's the cool guy. So they kind of turned him from Wally Cox into Steve McQueen. And for me, it didn't work. I didn't care as much about him anymore because his personality had changed. He wasn't facing a lot of the same problems and certainly not a lot of the same doubts that he had as Peter Parker. And it made him less relatable because how many of us were the cool kid in school? Certainly not most of us who were reading comics. So, I mean, I think it's pretty simple what you have to do. There's a template there. I mean, like I said, I used it on Robin. It wouldn't be that hard to apply it again to Spider-Man because that's where it came from. The origins of, for me, that brand of comic story began with Ditko's Spider-Man. Okay. Joshua Ignatowski again. Spock or Bones? Well, if I was in a tight corner somewhere, it would be Spock all day long. I would need his logic, his toughness. Because, Spock's a badass in addition to being, an intellect. But if I was on like a long car ride or a fishing trip, I'd want Dr. McCoy with me. Be far more entertaining to talk to. Oh, man. Joshua Ignatowski again. You've mentioned how Lego loves to make products that include Bane. Have they ever sent you any comp products? I have never received any comp products from Lego, but I've made enough money from their inclusion of Bane and Spoiler. They seem to like Spoiler too. They include her in a lot of games. I can go out and buy my own Lego sets if I care to. So no biggie. I don't expect Lego to send me comps, but I'm very grateful that they include him in play sets. They make minifigs of him all the time, and even more so, they include him in every DC game, even ones that don't make any sense. I mean, they had a Justice League in Space Lego game, and they found a way to include Bane. So I think they like Bane a lot. And but I used to when DC was through Diamond Direct producing their own action figures and plushies and things like that. I would get stuff from DC. The DC licensing people who were all wonderful. sometimes sent me some of the Fisher Price sets, the Imagine X sets that Bane appeared in. That's cool. And McFarlane Toys, if they produce anything Bane related, and I just send them an email, they send me one free, which is cool. I don't overuse that. I really only did it when they did one of those Build a Bane things where you had to buy like 6 action figures to get. And I said, man, is there any way I could get one of those Banes without having to buy, without having to spend $150 on action figures? And they said, you betcha. And they sent me one. So very cool. Nice people. Nice folks. Okay, Joshua Ignatowski again, but boom, it's a quadruple attack here. Who's your favorite villain in Connor Hawk's Rogues Gallery? I didn't even have to think about this. Tezcatlipoca. He's a guy who transforms himself into a earthly version of an Aztec jaguar god. I just thought, when I thought of him, I thought, oh my goodness, I can't wait to see Rodolfo DiMaggio draw this guy. And he's my favorite because he really was, in the hands of Rodolfo, and as the story turned out, he really was a terrifying character and quite the challenge for Connor Hawk because, as you can see, he takes a lot of punishment. Those arrows are not slowing this cat down. So, yeah, he was probably my favorite, mostly from a visual angle. I think I might have used him again a couple of times. I believe he appeared in Last Laugh in one of the issues. I just don't recall. But I was always trying to figure out ways to use this character during my time at DC. I should have done a story where he met Catwoman. But, hey, it could still happen, huh? Okay, last one from Joshua Ignatowski. In your opinion, Joshua's closing out the day. In your opinion, is a Philly cheesesteak truly a Philly cheesesteak if it doesn't have onions? No. No, what are you, crazy? To me, a Philly cheesesteak isn't a Philly cheesesteak unless it has onions, peppers, and mushrooms. An American cheese on a Amoroso hard roll. The roll is key. The roll is key here. And Amoroso is still is, biggest bread bakery in Philadelphia, always been in Philadelphia. And they'll send out their dough recipe to people out of state. I'll get to that. But the Philly cheesesteak, it grew out of, it was a cheap sandwich. It was the steak nobody wanted. It was the cheap steak, and they just slice it real thin and fry it up with onions. You gotta fry it up with onions. You gotta get the onion flavor into the mix, and then you throw some peppers on there, fry them up a little bit too. Throw the mushrooms on, fry them a little bit, and you have this, put the cheese on top, let it melt, American cheese. Got the big sloppy mess on the grill, fold that into the roll, and you're in cholesterol heaven. Some ketchup, maybe a little mustard. I don't know if I like a little mustard on mine. I don't know if that flies in the face of tradition. But I like a little ketchup, a little mustard, just a mess. It's the messiest sandwich in the world. I don't know how these businesses make money because their napkin budget must be through the roof. Now, another thing about cheesesteaks, just to exhaust the subject, and this is the last question. If you want to leave now, I'm not going to say anything more interesting except about cheesesteaks. People that visit Philadelphia that aren't from Philadelphia, and they think they know Philadelphia because, somebody took them to Pat's or Gino's in South Philly to have a cheesesteak. And people will say to me, people from Texas, Louisiana, wherever, well, you're from Philadelphia. Did you like Pat's or Gino's? The answer is neither. Neither Pat's nor Gino's is a real cheesesteak. I hate to say. They are not a real cheesesteak. They're a slab a minute steak with some cheese whiz on it. And it's not a cheesesteak. It is not chopped up. It's not always cooked with onions. It's cheese whiz? Seriously? It's like putting mayonnaise on a hoagie. I mean, please. Can't have it. So you want to find, some rinky-dink like corner place, and all over Philadelphia suburbs, there's plenty of hoagie and cheese steak places you can go to, and they're generally always better than Pat's or Gino's. So there you go. Now, you might say, well, Chuck, you don't live in Philadelphia anymore. Where do you get your cheesesteaks and your hoagies? Well, thankfully, Wawa opened down here. Wawa from Wawa, Pennsylvania, opened up, a whole bunch of, they were open one a week down here in Florida for a while there. And they make a hoagie. They make a great hoagie. They bring the water, they bring Philadelphia water down, because that's the key to bake the bread. So the bread's, indistinguishable from the bread I grew up with as a kid. And they make a hoagie the way hoagie should be made, with oil and vinegar, and to your liking. Boom, I'm home again. As far as cheesesteaks go, there's two places down here in Philly that make a darn good cheesesteak in the tradition of all those Philadelphia greasy spoons. So I'm okay. I'm okay on that end. And Wawa even carries tasty pies. Well, they don't carry the full variety, which is sad. But there is a place here. It's Philadelphia Flavor, and they even have the Daily News there every day, the Philadelphia Daily News, which is a total rag of a tabloid. And they had tasty pies and Hers chips and all that frosty root beer. So there you go. Okay. If you have any food preferences, want to share a menu, tell me about, reminisce about mom's cooking, contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com. brunobookstore@gmail.com is the most reliable, steady way to reach me with your questions, answers, suggestions, kitty pictures, doggy pictures, and all the rest. So I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for watching, liking, subscribing, whatever you did. And thank you for the awesome questions. You people ask the greatest questions. Some are real thought provokers. Some make me think a bit. Some make me go back and do minimal research. As you've all pointed out, I often make mistakes on this podcast, but I willingly admit that, mea culpa. I don't remember everything perfectly. Who does? And if I had to do full research, I could only do one of these a month. So thank you for your patience as well. And